Good morning. I thought it would be a really good piece of information to go through our garden and do a garden tour and talk about how we preserve each and every thing we grow. So let's go take a tour. All right, so coming into the garden here, we have asparagus, very overgrown asparagus. And asparagus is something that we mostly eat fresh. You could freeze it. I have dehydrated a little bit, but for the most part, we just eat it fresh. Pickled asparagus is also a great option. Then in here, we had peas, and our peas, we always eat them fresh. I don't like preserving peas because they're a lot of work, but you could freeze or can peas. I also had a garlic patch here, and garlic is something that we cure along with the onions that are planted there. We also cure onions. And then those just get stored in our basement for the rest of the winter. Over here we have some pole green beans, and green beans, my favorite method is to can them. You can also blanch and freeze them. I choose canning for best preservation. Then we have broccoli and cauliflower. And broccoli and cauliflower we mostly eat fresh, and then we blanch some and freeze it for the winter. Moving on here, we have sweet potatoes, red potatoes, and gold potatoes. Those are all cured and just stored in the basement for winter. Now when I talk about storing in the basement, you want it in a cool, dark place. The coolest, darkest place in your house is best if you don't have a root cellar. Then we have rhubarb, which my rhubarb I just chop up and freeze until winter when I make jam out of it. Cucumbers, I mostly like to eat them fresh, but of course lots of pickles is what people use and preserve cucumbers for. We just don't eat that many pickles, so I do a little bit, but not a ton. Then we move into our beets. And for beets, I like to pickle my beets or store them in the refrigerator. They store for a really long time in the refrigerator. Carrots, I mostly store in the refrigerator, or I do can a few if we have an abundance. They again store for a long time in the refrigerator. Next up, we have all different varieties of kidney beans, and so those just dry and get stored in jars on the shelf. Again, cool dark place is best, but really we store ours in our pantry and they do just fine. Purple beans and some green beans, again, canning is my favorite method of preservation for those, but you can also blanch and freeze. Then we move on to some cabbage, and cabbage, my favorite is chopping it up and making sauerkraut. It also stores for a really long time in the fridge, so don't feel like you have to do that right away. More onions. Then we move on to, these are black-eyed peas. And those just dry and store in a jar as well. Then we have peppers, and peppers are my favorite for canning, using for salsa. I do that with my onions as well, but otherwise I just chop them up and freeze them, or even freeze the whole pepper. I like to chop them up because it makes them a little bit more convenient for using. Then tomatoes. There's so many ways you can store tomatoes, in a million different ways. Actually, at the end of the season, we pull our plants and just store them in the shed, and they continue to ripen. We can a ton of tomatoes. We make salsa with a ton of tomatoes and pasta sauce. So lots of canning with tomatoes. I also, at the end of the season, will chop up and freeze what I have left after canning that I just don't have time to get to right away because we're going into fall harvest in the field. So lots of methods for tomatoes. Dehydrating is also a great option. And of course, if you had a freeze dryer, that would be excellent for lots of things. Then we move on to strawberries. And strawberries and raspberries for our fruit, I will freeze and make jam in the wintertime or put in smoothies. I also buy bulk peaches and cherries and do the same. So I am a freeze girl for fruit, and then in the wintertime, if I want to make jam, I do so then. And and then we have pumpkins, squash, like winter squash, butternut squash, those types of things I cure and just store in a cool, dark place for the winter. And zucchini, I basically store it in banana bread form or zucchini bread form, or store some just frozen for making zucchini bread in the winter time. But that's the only way I really store zucchini. So that is kind of the tour of our garden and how I choose to preserve things. And so I'd like to know what your favorite ways are for preserving. Let us know and share it with others. Otherwise, I hope that helps in your preserving journey.